Israel Update with Gadi Tau and Mike Dooran. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Tablet's Israel Update, which we will devote to Syria once again, or rather to Israel and Turkey facing each other in Syria. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast, you know something about Mike's opinion, which he will summarize very briefly. But as you know, how should I put it, Mike? Not everyone agrees with you on this subject, or at least there have been known to be some disagreement. And so one disagreeer is a friend of both of us. We both listen to his opinions carefully, and at least often feel we have to answer them. And he was a guest on this podcast. His name is Professor Dan Shiftán. Shalom, Dan.
Hello, Gadi. Hello, Don. I think that Don was not just a guest, but he has one of our most popular episodes ever, which is a thorn in my side.
Yeah, Dan is a kind of a rock star in certain very strange circles. So without further ado, Mike.
By the way, I had somebody define it very nicely. Dan is widely known in narrow circles.
I think I've heard that before, and I think I should have mentioned another thing in this introduction is also that if you think Israelis are rude, that's because you haven't met Dan Shiftán yet. He broke all records and
arrogant.
Arrogant.
Rude,
and we have
arrogant and modest. Yeah.
We have two people standing on both sides of his frame, so you can't see them in case he goes out of control. So, Mike, over to you. Please remind us of the rudimentaries of how you think Israel should conduct its policy vis-a-vis Turkey in Syria, and why.
Thanks, Gadi. I can't think of anyone that I would more enjoy, anyone with whom I would enjoy more. I can't even finish this sentence. It's such a pleasure to argue violently with Dan Shiftán, is what I'm trying to say. So very, very briefly, my position is that there is an accommodation to be had between Turkey and Israel in Syria. I think that from the American point of view and from the point of view of stability of the Middle East, there's almost no issue that's more important right now than finding an accommodation between Turkey and Israel, and that such an accommodation is possible. There's a tendency among Israelis and pro-Israelis to say that Erdogan is an enemy, that it's a zero-sum game between Turkey and Israel, and that therefore Israel should support the PKK in northeast Syria. That's the complex that the United States has created between the YPG and the American Special Forces in northeast Syria, creating Kurdish autonomous zones. There's a tendency among Israelis to want to do that, especially because Erdogan has taken such very strong positions on Gaza. He's supporting Hamas, including hosting Hamas leaders in Turkey, and as a kind of a tit for tat, the Israelis have a tendency to want to support the PKK in northeast Syria. Plus, they see it as a way of impeding the Turkish project of unifying Syria under the Turkish umbrella. I think this is a mistake because I think it will turn Syria into an arena for Israeli-Turkish conflict unnecessarily, because as I say, I think there's an accommodation to be had there. I could say a lot more, but that's the essence of my position.
Excellent. Dan, you've listened to not just the essence, but also the full conversation that Mike and I had last time. So the floor is yours for a rebuttal.
Well, first, it is a joy to disagree with Mike. Going back to 1952, I would say I like Mike. So a lot of the things we agree on, and we've had discussions over the situation in the Middle East and American-Israeli relations and so on. But here I very, very sharply disagree. I think Erdogan is an arch enemy of Israel, and the first distinction I have to make is between Turkey and Erdogan. Turkey is potentially an ally of Israel, used to be an ally of Israel, has common interests with Israel. I think that Erdogan's Turkey and Turkey are two different things, like Hitler's Germany or the mullah's Iran or what have you. Bernard Lewis said that maybe one day Turkey will become Iran and Iran will become Turkey. Namely, one day perhaps Israel will be in a position to cooperate with the Iranians after the mullah's regime is over, and maybe Turkey can emerge as a major threat to Israel. We are not there yet, but I think we do have a zero-sum game. I disagree very profoundly with the perception that we heard from Mike, primarily because after all, and more than anything else, Erdogan is a Muslim brother. Now, one of the enormous dangers of the Muslim Brotherhood, forget about Turkey for a moment, look at the Middle East, look at the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're very good in pretending that they are people you can work with, that actually they only have radical slogans, but they are pragmatists and they're willing. And by the way, there is no major confrontation between being a pragmatist and being a radical. Every radical is also a pragmatist on other issues. The question is, where does your radicalism show? And the Muslim Brotherhood is the worst danger of anybody in the Middle East because they are the obstacle for the Middle East meeting the challenges of the 20th century. Forget the 21st century, the 20th century. Whatever is Muslim Brotherhood is the worst thing that can possibly happen for Egypt, for Jordan, for Morocco, for the Arabs inside Israel, for countries in the Gulf. It is the ultimate enemy of any kind of stability in the region. Let me say that when Morsi took over in Egypt, and then after a short while, thank God, we had a military coup and Sisi took over. When Morsi was in power, my argument was that Israel will need to double its defense expenditure because the threat of an all-Arab war against Israel led by Egypt that terminated in 1979 could come back if the Muslim Brothers would have taken power. The Muslim Brothers started fighting against Israel before Egypt went into the war in 1948. The Muslim Brothers, everywhere they are the danger to any attempt to modernize the Arab world, to try to improve the situation for the individual person in the Middle East, to have somewhat more tolerance in the region. So in the final analysis, in my reading, Erdogan is a Muslim brother. Now, I remember this argument, a very similar argument that we're having now, having it with many Israelis in 2003, 2004, when Erdogan was just in the beginning, when Obama believed that this is the new moderate in the Muslim world. When you go back to his speech in Ankara after his speech in Cairo. So at the time we had the belief, yes, he's a Muslim brother, but he can deliver a kind of moderate Islam, a kind of Islam that we can live with. Yes, maybe the rhetoric will be radical, but in the final analysis, it is something that you can live with. Erdogan.
Ideology is the major obstacle.
Not just ideology. The inevitable practice of the ideology. I don't mind somebody that has a very radical ideology, but does nothing about it. But the practical application, and by the way, not just in Syria, not just with Israel, not just in the Middle East. Look at what happened to Turks in Germany, in Belgium. Look at what's happening in Europe when the Turks that integrated in German society radicalized as a result of Erdogan's radicalization of Turkey. Erdogan is the opposite of Mustafa Kemal.
So what should Israel do in Syria then, vis-a-vis Turkey?
I think that what Israel wants in Syria is a weak Syria. Because if Syria is united under whatever patronage, it will come back to confront Israel and rebuild a very strong army, and the issue of the Golan Heights will be raised again, and the Turks are perfect to bring up the issue of the Golan Heights. Wherever you have any kind of relations between Israel and Turkey, the Turks are dead set against Israel, not only in Gaza, in Jerusalem, with radical Muslim forces on Temple Mount. The Turks are there. Wherever you see radical forces, the Turks are there. Now, unlike what Mike suggested concerning radical Israelis, this is not me. I don't believe in working with the PKK in eastern Turkey in order to topple Erdogan's regime. I think this is a very radical approach, and I would certainly not go in this direction. But I think that the one reason that Erdogan is not all out supporting terrorism against Israel is his fear that Israel will do it. And I think this fear is good. It's a deterrent against Erdogan going even further than it did. By the way, remember that he is the only country who severed economic relations with Israel as a result of the war in Gaza. And because the balance of trade favors Turkey, Turkey lost much more than Israel did. His commitment, accept a military confrontation, accept violent confrontation, he confronts us on every front you can possibly imagine.
Mike, I'm sure you were convinced.
No, I disagree, and I disagree strongly. And I jotted down here 5 points of disagreement. I probably won't go through all of them. Let me just hit one that I want to hit very hard, and I think I could come to the others later, but this one I think is the single most important difference between me and Don, is that I think that Turkey is much bigger than Erdogan now. And that is the essence of my argument. Don is presenting a Turkey in which Erdogan controls every aspect of the country. I don't actually believe, among my 5 things, I don't actually believe that Erdogan is a Muslim brother. But let's forget about that for a moment. Let's just assume that everything that Don says for a moment. Let's just assume that everything he says about Erdogan is true. I think this analysis misses a huge transformation in Turkey in the last, let's say, 8 years since the coup attempt in 2016. The coup attempt marks the high water mark in Turkey of Islamism as a governing idea, because the coup was carried out by the Gulenists, who are Islamists, and there was an alliance between Erdogan's AK party and the Gulenists. When the coup attempt happened, it laid bare before all of Turkish society the corruption of the Islamists. The Gulenists had infiltrated the military, they had infiltrated the police, the justice system, and so forth. And you have, as a result of this, a phenomenon in Turkey that is similar to what we know of in Iran. I mean, Don said that Turkey might become Iran someday. That's not what's happening at all. Just as we know that in Iran, the regime remains committed to a violent Islamist ideology, the population has become more and more secular. Something very similar has gone on in Turkey. And the AK parties, the children of the leaders of the AK party, are much more, that is Erdogan's party, are much more secular than their parents are. What happened after 2016 is that Erdogan had to make an alliance with the defense establishment. Defense establishment is committed to realpolitik, pragmatism, and basically traditional Turkish nationalism. If I send you something, Gadi, can we share the screen here?
I can try, yeah.
Am I allowed to open the screen?
I don't think you are, but send it to me on WhatsApp and I'll show
I'll send it to you on WhatsApp. But what I'm gonna send you is a picture, a recent meeting of Erdogan with Anthony Blinken, and he well, you know, I can't figure out how to do this while I'm talking. I don't want to take too much time here, but basically, he met Anthony Blinken just last week. And Blinken on one side, Erdogan on the other side, or no, Blinken on one side, Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister on the other side, Erdogan in the middle, and above Erdogan, a huge picture of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. You don't have to be a real sensitive observer of symbols to understand what Erdogan is saying to his own public here. He's got Blinken on one side, Hakan Fidan on the other, and there's Ataturk in the middle, right above Erdogan. And Erdogan is saying, I am Ataturk. This represents actually an acknowledgement of defeat by Erdogan if his project was the Islamization of Turkey and the erasing of the Ataturk legacy and returning to a kind of Ottoman sensibility. The best he can say now is that he is the Turkish nationalist leader. And I think that's how Turks actually see him. This represents like I say, the alliance between the security establishment and Erdogan. And we've seen it, you know, Don says that there's the inevitable application of his ideology. But if you look at what Erdogan has done throughout his career, there have been these remarkable about faces. And one of the ones that we've all seen in our own eyes in the last few years was he ended all of the conflict with the Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, and also with Egypt over the issue of support for their opposition movements. He also was ending the conflict with Israel. The Gaza war came, and he reversed himself on Israel, but he didn't reverse himself with regard to his Arab neighbors, which means he's not actually pursuing an Islamist ideological agenda with those neighbors. Now, the question of Syria, because he is backing Islamists in Syria at this moment, this raises the question again. But we're seeing all of the signals that we're getting from the Turks through Jolani, through the leader of Syria, is that they want to reduce any fear among their fellow Arabs that they are trying to carry out some kind of populist revolution across the Middle East. That's not the signal they are sending at all. And I think Israel wants to be very careful not to take steps like supporting the PKK that are going to create conflicts with Turkey that don't exist, or expand the area of conflict beyond where it already exists. One last sentence, Scotty, I see you want to stop me. Because my fear is that if Israel goes too far in threatening Turkey, what it will do, especially with issues like the PKK, is it will unite the security establishment behind Erdogan. And the people that Israel wants in Turkey to listen to it and to find an accommodation with it will not be there when it needs them.
So, Dan, can I just draw a circle around a possible area of agreement before you go to the disagreement? Do you agree that there is no need to poke Turkey in the eye with the PKK now as we try to understand what's going on in Syria?
The problem of my discussion with Mike is that his assumption is that if Israel is in any way associated with the Kurds in northern Syria, this necessarily is supporting the PKK. I disagree. There is a major difference between supporting the Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, which is a major Israeli interest, and I want the Kurds to continue to control this area in Syria that is east of the Euphrates, and supporting the PKK in Turkey, fighting against the central government in Istanbul. I think that
Sorry, in Istanbul or Damascus?
No, Istanbul. I mean, my problem is I'm not willing to accept the notion that when Israel has good relations with the Kurds in Syria, this undermines the Turkey inside Turkey by supporting the PKK, challenging the central government of Turkey inside Turkey. Israel should not do it. I think I'm delighted if it is in Erdogan's mind so that he doesn't go too far to support actual terrorism the way the Iranians supported terrorism against Israel. I think this is one thing that keeps him from doing so. But I don't think Israel should go in this direction. Israel should keep very good relations with the Kurds in northern Syria, in northeast Syria, and not support the PKK inside Turkey, challenging the central government in Turkey. Okay, so these are two separate things. But our profound disagreement is about the nature of Erdogan. Erdogan knows how to pretend not to be a Muslim brother. This is exactly what he did in the beginning when he came to power. He managed to fool everybody, including Israelis and Americans. I mean, Americans want to be fooled, so that's the easiest. They come and very politely ask, will you please cheat us? And then polite people will cheat Americans on practically everything. But when it comes to Israel, it's not so easy to cheat Israel. And Israelis believed Erdogan in the beginning that he is willing to go in the positive direction. What I'm saying is every time it is tested, and by the way, not only in direct Israeli-Arab confrontation, for instance, the attempt of Erdogan to work with one part of the Libyan government in order to create the entire Eastern Mediterranean as an exclusive economic zone for Turkey, undermining Egypt, undermining Cyprus, undermining Israel, undermining Greece. This was another attempt where you inevitably clash with Turkey. Wherever you go, Turkey is on the wrong side of Israel. Now, I do agree, you asked for agreement with Mike, I do agree that historically the Turkish military was the strongest ally of Israel in Turkey. I also agree that maybe it is now not as bad as it used to be in other parts. I don't agree that they are today the voice of pragmatism in Turkey, because I don't think that the final analysis, the decision is with them. But what I'm suggesting is that whenever Erdogan wants to strengthen his position inside Turkish public opinion, he becomes more anti-Israeli, and he already tied himself inside Turkey to the most anti-Israeli, most extreme anti-Israeli approach, calling Netanyahu Hitler, speaking of Israel in a way that is repulsive and anti-Semitic. This is something that is part of his political base inside Turkey, inside the Turkish political system. So I don't see any positive role for him in Syria. Let me put it this way. Even if Israel will try its best, it cannot prevent Turkey from having a role in Syria. But Israel should not encourage it. Israel should not be fooled by it. Israel should consider it as a danger rather than an opportunity.
Mike?
Okay, Don raised 3 or 4 separate issues here. Once again, Erdogan is Turkey, and there's there is basically no difference between Turkey and Erdogan in today's Turkey. I'll come back to that in a second. Secondly, the situation in the Northeast, and then the issue of the Mediterranean, and then finally the issue of Israel in Turkish politics. Let's just for a second focus on the northeast of Syria. I profoundly disagree with Don that there is a way that the Israelis can distinguish between support for what he calls the Kurds in northeast Syria and support for the PKK inside Turkey. That's because I won't go deeply into it because you and I talked about it at length in the previous episode. The United States allied in Syria with the PKK. These are Syrian Kurds who are part of the Turkish Kurdish movement to break Turkey into two states, a Turkish state and a Kurdish state. The equivalent, as I said in our previous episode, this is the equivalent of the United States going into Jordan and building up Hamas, an organization headed by Hamas, and arming and training and equipping it inside Jordan. And then when the Israelis say, hey, you're building up Hamas right next to us on our border, we say, no. This has got nothing to do, the Hamas that we're working with in Jordan has nothing to do with the Hamas that's causing you problems inside Israel. Every Israeli would say that is a distinction without a difference. Every Turk says that's a distinction without a difference. Every Turk, including Erdogan's staunchest political enemies, including the security establishment, they all say the United States has built up this entity in northeast Syria that is the PKK. And so if Israel has good relations with that entity, it's going to be seen by everyone in Turkey, friends of Erdogan, enemies of Erdogan, as the enemy of Turkey. And that is exactly what the Israelis do not want to do, in my view. They don't want to do it because it will, as I say, it will alienate all Turks. But there's another argument here, another plank to the argument. That entity is slated for destruction. It is the biggest mistake that the United States ever made in the Middle East, and I'm not engaging in hyperbole here. I cannot think of a dumber thing that the United States has ever done for all the reasons I talked about in the previous podcast, Gadi. But Donald Trump is inclined to pull the American forces from northeast Syria. He's inclined to do that. He ordered it the last time he was in power. He was defied by his own military. He's coming back now with a vengeance to prove to the American people that he is in charge of American security establishment and not the anti-Trump forces. There is a strong domestic imperative for Trump to pull those forces. I also think it's the right thing to do because of relations with Turkey. So Israel, if it associates with that project strongly, it is putting a bet on a horse that has lost the race already. The race has been run, it lost, and now Israel is betting on it. So it makes no sense from a point of view of maintaining pragmatic relationships with Turkey, or in terms of having an actual influence over events. This is poking the Turks in the eye for no reason and then losing the game. It's a fundamental, and this is where Don should be agreeing with me, given his principles of understanding international politics. It's a fundamental rule of power politics that you don't take a position that you know is going to lose.
Done.
You wanted to go back to the Mediterranean. I will be interested in hearing your comment on this and also on the radicalization of Turks in Germany and in other parts of Europe.
Okay, let me say about the Mediterranean. I think that's very important. Your depiction, Don, of the Turkish position on the Mediterranean, I think is inaccurate. The country that has the country that has laid claim to basically all of the Mediterranean or all of the Eastern Mediterranean, or a huge, let's say, a huge chunk of the Eastern Mediterranean is Greece. And Greece has laid claim, has a theory of how the economic exclusive zone of Greece should be understood, which will basically relegate Turkey to its coastline and to just a couple of kilometers from its coastline. The Turks have said, this cannot be. We are the country with the largest coastline in the Mediterranean. We are a significant power. There is no way that we are simply going to be relegated to our coastline. And so what they did in answer to the outrageous Greek claims is they went to Libya and they cut a deal with Libya where the two of them have defined their exclusive economic zone, splitting the Mediterranean between the two of them. What's going to happen is this should end in the Turks are staking a claim to in a negotiation with the Greeks and with the Americans. Actually, this is always a debate about American policy, about what the exclusive economic zones should be. The Greek claims are outrageous. And here again, I think that the Israelis have aligned themselves with the enemies of Turkey in a way that is very unwise. And I'll give you a specific example. I talked to a very senior Turkish official. Very senior. I don't want to say who it was, but you would know the name if I said it. And this is just before October 7th. And I said, as I read the map of the Middle East now, the tensions between Turkey and Iran are rising. And obviously there's an Iranian-Israeli conflict going on. So is there a possibility for Israel and Turkey to have greater cooperation against Iran? And the official said to me, our relations with Israel have improved significantly in the last year, and we're hoping for greater improvement, particularly in the area of exploitation of natural gas. However, the Israelis need to understand that in many areas, their policies are still objectively anti-Turkish. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, take for example, the Aegean Sea. We make a distinction between the Aegean and the Mediterranean. And if you are carrying out exercises. If you're carrying out military, he was speaking to me in Hebrew, of course. I don't know why. He said, if you're carrying out military exercises with the Greeks in the Aegean, that is objectively anti-Turkish, because the Aegean is a sea that is split between Turkey and Greece only. If you're doing it with the Greeks in the Mediterranean, that's we have a different attitude toward that, because the Mediterranean is a very large sea, lots of different coastlines, and so on and so forth. Now, after he said that to me, I went and I talked to lots of Israeli officials I'm talking about, not at the highest levels, not necessarily everyone I should have. I didn't encounter a single Israeli who was aware of the fact that the Turks make this distinction between the Aegean and the Mediterranean. So if you're going to go to Turkey's, by the way, the Greeks are very good at this. They do it with the Americans all the time. They come to the Americans and they say, "Oh, we can help you with your defense issues if you put a base right here on island X," thereby increasing the power of the Greek claims to the island or to the exclusive economic zone, and so on, when the dumb Americans are not even aware that this is happening. The Israelis cannot afford to be as dumb as the Americans and be weaponized by the Greeks so that they carry out a foreign policy that is more Greek than the Greek foreign policy. The Greeks have all kinds of accommodations with the Turks everywhere. There's no reason why the Israelis shouldn't have accommodations with them as well. The Turks are exceptionally good, just like the Russians and others that we know, at compartmentalizing and having a conflict over file X, but not letting it bleed into file Y. And that's the characteristic that I think that the Israelis should be working to take advantage of. Not that the Turks love them, not that they're going to ever love them or see them as brothers or anything else, but that the Turks have a whole set of priorities that they are pursuing way before they ever get to the issue of their conflict with Israel. There's no reason why the Israelis should inject themselves into these other priorities and associate themselves with the anti-Turkish agenda that the Greeks have, that the PKK has, that the United Arab Emirates has, and so on. Israel has its own interests. It should define them very clearly, and it should interact with Turkey on the basis of those.
Done.
I think that once the Turks aligned themselves with Hamas, namely with the destruction of the state of Israel, everything else pales in comparison with it. And I agree with you that Israel may, challenge the Turks on a number of issues. I would do it 5 times as much. Because if you don't stop aligning yourself with the enemies of the existence of the state of Israel, you are our enemies. And I don't think it will help, because the assumption of the Turks is they can do to Israel whatever they want, but Israel will be careful. The only thing I would be careful about is not to challenge what you mentioned before, namely not to support the PKK in breaking up Turkey into a Kurdish and a Turkish state. This is the only thing I wouldn't go so far as to do. Everything else, the Turks cannot be anti-Israeli on everything all the time without exception. And the Israelis will not work with the Greeks, with the Cypriots, with the Martians, as far as I'm concerned, because whatever strengthens Turkey is dangerous for Israel. And again, it comes back to the Muslim Brotherhood and the fact that he pretends to be a person who is in the line of Mustafa Kemal. He is the opposite. He is the antithesis of Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal wanted to bring Turkey into a closer association with the West. He wanted to distance himself from Muslim radicalism. Erdogan associates himself with the worst part. I can't imagine anything more antithesis to Mustafa Kemal than him. Now, the whole Turkish state is built on the image of Mustafa Kemal, so he pretends to be there, but he is the extreme opposite of it. If the Turks one day, and I don't care if it's genuine or not, I don't care about these things being genuine. If the Turks will be willing to dissociate themselves from being anti-Israeli on everything that really matters, then Israel should be more careful in the Aegean Sea.
Would it be a valid definition to say that you are portraying Mike's attitude as appeasement and yours as deterrence?
No, because if Mike were an appeaser, we couldn't discuss anything, because these are different cultures. The people come. No, this is not appeasement, because if I started from Mike's assumptions, I would come to Mike's conclusions. Okay, so my problem with him is not he correctly reads the situation and then he is willing to appease. What I'm saying is we read the situation in a very different way, Mike and I, okay? So this is why I think the argument between us is interesting. Otherwise, it would be boring, okay? Because it is basically one Weltanschauung against another Weltanschauung, and it never gets decided. I think that I agree with Mike that Erdogan changed his position on issues from one extreme to the other. But the only thing he always comes back to is to be anti-Israel. The only consistent thing with him is whatever he pretends to be, after a very short while, he comes back to become anti-Israel. And the fact that he does these changes over Gaza, where the issue is nothing but the obsession of the barbarians in Gaza to kill every Jew. This is what Gaza is about. And he is so committed to Gaza that it overshadows everything else. And the fact that it overshadows tells me something about what will come when push comes to shove.
So I'll try another definition, and I'll try it with you, Mike. Is this argument about what is the actual real motivation and what is the outside dressing?
Yes, I think it is. And let me say a few things here. Let me actually agree with Don about something. I think he's on to something important when he says that there is this consistency with regard to Erdogan about Israel, when there's an inconsistency about Muslim brother ideology with respect to the other Muslims.
Don't make too many concessions to Don, because he reacts better to deterrence.
Okay.
Just saying.
I'm going to come back and argue with him in a second. I think it's there. I think that that Erdogan personally has a deep, consistent, and abiding problem with the state of Israel and Zionism. I think that is. I think that that's true, and I think that we see it. However, we also have to recognize that there is a strong anti-Zionism in Turkish society and among his electoral base. It's there. It's there throughout all Muslim societies, and we have to understand that this is the starting point. Erdogan, it's not true that Erdogan, immediately when Gaza broke out, ended trade relations with Israel. He made some steps in that direction, but did not follow through. And then after the local elections, the Yeniden Refah Partisi, the new Refah party, popped up to his right and attacked him on Gaza and won some significant victories in the local elections. And then he instituted other measures against Israel. So clearly reacting to an electoral defeat rather than just from his own personal ideology. There are a lot of things he has not done, and these need to be looked at very carefully. Israel gets over 1/3 of its oil from Azerbaijan. That oil comes across Turkey, by pipeline to the port of Ceyhan. Erdogan has not cut off the oil. He was accused publicly, repeatedly, and in the harshest terms by the Iranians as being pro-Zionist, and they demanded that he shut down the oil. Greta Thunberg actually joined in and said that he is supporting the war in Gaza and should cut off the oil. He didn't do it. So it is wrong to say everywhere he is as anti-Israeli as he could possibly be. This is absolutely one of the most important areas. Azerbaijan is one of Israel's most important allies. We now know, we didn't know it at first, when after October 7th, Israel had a problem receiving oil shipments because the insurance companies would not insure the tankers coming to Israel. Israel is very vulnerable to an oil embargo, and it was a major issue in the opening days of this war. Who came to Israel's aid? SOCAR, the state company of the Azerbaijanis. The Azerbaijanis arranged through their reciprocal relationships with other companies. They arranged for shipments of oil to come to Israel. Israel's relationship with Azerbaijan is at the what do you call it? At the pleasure of the Turks. If the Turks were to decide that Israel was an actual enemy, and they wanted to really punish it in the most serious ways, they could cut off the relationship with Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan is the junior partner with Turkey. Turkey is by far its most important security partner. Israel is its second, but geographically, their relations with Israel are dependent on the Turks. When Israeli ministers, as a number have, go out and they make comments about the Kurds in northeast Syria, which I say is the PKK, they are putting their Azerbaijani allies in an extremely difficult situation. So it's a big mistake to do this, and things done is wrong. Things could get a lot worse than they are right now, because Erdogan's support for Hamas is primarily rhetorical. It's upsetting, and to be sure, it's not to be taken lightly. But what we don't want is for it to escalate into acts of real in the material world that could really damage Israel.
He does offer them asylum. Hamas.
Yes. It's not. I said primarily rhetorical. He hosts them as well, but there are a lot of things he could do that are a lot worse that he doesn't do. I'm struck.
And why, Mike? What is his point of view about it? Why does he not?
Because of what I said before, Erdogan does not run Turkey with an iron hand. It is an alliance between him and the nationalists as represented by the security establishment. And the foreign policy that he has been carrying out since he ditched, since 2016, basically, is more nationalist than it is Islamist by far. There is this consistency. There's this gnawing anti-Israel element to it. But I think that our goal should be to make sure that the anti-Israel element to his policy is contained. And it's not, like I say, that Syria doesn't become an arena of contest between Israel and Turkey. What we should be aiming for is Syria to become a buffer between Turkey and Israel. And that is in the interest of both countries. Both security establishments can find ways, very simple formulas, that will allow Syria to function as a buffer, just as Jordan functions as a buffer between Iraq and Israel. Let me say one last thing here, if I may. I know I've said a lot. I'm really struck when I talk to Israelis, like Don, but Israelis in general, at the difference in attitude between Israelis toward Russia in Syria and Turkey in Syria. Now, Russia is allied materially with Iran in Syria, but also in Ukraine. Iran became much stronger on the global stage because of the alliance with Russia. Now, Putin was not anti-Israel in the way that Erdogan is. There's no history of statements, although Putin has received Hamas in Moscow. He doesn't host them, but he's received them, and he's building up Israel's staunchest enemy, which is firing ballistic missiles at Israel, which is on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon, and which is armed, trained, and equipped the greatest military threat to Israel, which is Hezbollah in the north. The Israelis recognize this threat, but they still manage to compartmentalize their conflicts with Russia and to have areas where they cooperate, areas where they disagree, and to be extremely careful about not letting conflict in one compartment bleed over into another. My contention, I'll end right, one more sentence, Don, and I'll end right there. I think it's clear. My contention is that Turkey is exactly the same kind of power as Russia. Exactly the same kind. And Israel should pursue its relations with Turkey like it would with Russia. And Israel should recognize that Turkey is more powerful than Russia.
Done.
I think there is a very major difference between Russia in Syria and Turkey in Syria. First of all, Turkey is geographically alongside Syria, so it can have a much greater impact. Second, what the Russians maintained is a system in Syria that was very convenient for Israel because Syria was weak, and Israel could, for more than a decade, have two military operations in Syria every week for more than a decade, and the Syrians did not respond. Russia in Syria did not rebuild a Syrian army, as I'm afraid Syria, if it is united, will build as soon as possible. I mean, this is what Arab states are about. They're an army that owns a state rather than a state having an army. So this situation of a weak, divided Syria, if we could have it for 100 years, I would buy it, because the alternative is much worse for Israel. Also, ideologically speaking, this element here is where you and I very strongly disagree. I may agree with you that there are elements in Syria who are in Turkey that are much less committed to Muslim Brotherhood than Erdogan and his party. Yes, I agree, this exists in Syria, but this exists in Turkey. But as long as Turkey is Erdogan, and maybe one day after Erdogan is dead, or after his party is defeated, or after the political composition inside Turkey changes, Turkey will again become a great opportunity for Israel, and then you and I will completely agree. The personality of Erdogan changed a lot. Among other things, it's not just that other parties are more radical. For many years, Turks accepted Israeli tourists very willingly. Israelis felt very comfortable in Syria, in Turkey. What Erdogan did was to radicalize his own population, to radicalize the Turks in Germany. We have not spoken about it. I think it's a tremendously important issue, because now the proportion of Turks in Germany who supported Erdogan was higher the proportion of Turks in Turkey that supported Erdogan. And that's a major danger if you look at the broader picture of the impact of Turkey in Europe. By the way, if I were a European, I would try to find a way to get Turkey out of NATO. I think the cooperations with the Russians, the S-400, the fact that you can never trust the Turks. Again, they used to be the most trustworthy element in NATO for many, many years, when the army was different than the army is today, when the judicial system in Turkey was different than it is today. You are right that not all of Turkey is Erdogan, but Erdogan has a huge impact. And if this impact comes into Syria, if Syria becomes a Turkish client, if Syria becomes a Turkish proxy, then the attempt of Erdogan to reestablish himself in the areas that used to be that of the Ottoman Empire will be much, much easier. He will have a hold. Now, he's also more dangerous than Iran, because Iran is Shiite and has a problem in establishing itself in an essentially Sunni area. He is Sunni Muslim. He is so strongly associated with the Muslim Brothers, even if it is not the organizational part of the Muslim Brothers, the sentiment of Sunni radicalism will be strengthened by Erdogan. And all of this Russia cannot do, because Russia is alien. It can sit in Tartus and in Hamamim, and it can help the regime remain in power, and then you can much easier compartmentalize the relationship with Russia than you can with Turkey. So my argument with you is not on principles of political science, that compartmentalization can be very effective, that you need to see internal forces that are different than the leader. All of that is fine. Only my reading of Turkey is different than your reading, and my reading of Erdogan is different than your reading. Now, you probably know more about it when it comes to Turkey itself. I've not studied it. I don't know enough about it. I'm willing to accept a lot of what you've said here. It makes sense on this issue. But I have seen what he's done in the region at large. For instance, in Jerusalem itself, when we have the Morabitat on the Temple Mount, he would love to get his hands there.
And just explain the term, Dan.
These are Muslim women who insist on the Arab nature of what they call the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque for them is not only the Temple Mount, but everything in Jerusalem. So this is something where you challenge Israel and you try to mobilize the Muslim world against Israel. I don't want the Turks involved. My number one suggestion to anybody who deals with Gaza, Jerusalem, or whatever, first make sure that the Turks are not in. They don't have their hands in it. Because I'm afraid this is a country that is potentially much stronger than other enemies of Israel. And since Egypt is no longer an active enemy of Israel, I'm afraid of a strong enemy much more than a weak enemy, and a nearby enemy much more than a faraway enemy. And you're right, Mike, we have enemies, we have an assortment of enemies, but the more damage these enemies can do, the more careful I have to be. Now, I'll give you that what you said about oil is important. Yes, you're right, they have not used everything they can, but correct me if I'm wrong, this is because they need a reputation. They want to be the area where everybody is willing to bring his energies through Turkey. And therefore, if they will do that, they will undermine their international reputation about separating the security of energy supply from political confrontations. But you're right, they have not used everything. I don't want to give them the opportunity.
Mike, I want to give you a short response and then ask a final question, which will, I think, zoom out to the larger context. But please just respond briefly to these last points.
Well, thank you. This has been a very useful conversation because we have, in Don's last remarks, the last few remarks he made, I think we are able to kind of encapsulate the disagreement productively. I agree. I wholly agree with Don that Turkey is more powerful than Russia, and more powerful in Syria, and more powerful all around the Middle East. And I have been predicting the rise of the Turks since 2016. I can see it clearly because the United States is pulling back. Because Russia, despite all of the appearances the contrary, is actually a declining power, because Iran is a bizarre power which has some disruptive military capabilities, drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles that allow it to project power, but has no regular military. Turkey is a different animal altogether. It has all dimensions of power. It has the second biggest army in NATO. It has soft power. It has economic power. It has a sophisticated understanding of itself in the world, and so on. We have to treat it with respect. And the Israelis, the United States needs to treat it with respect, and it has not been by building up its number one enemy in northeast Syria. It deserves the same kind of respect that the Israelis give to the Russians. And Israel has no choice, I believe, but to attempt to compartmentalize. And the last few statements that Don made, where he said, well, the reason the Turks have not cut off the Israeli oil is because the Turks want to be an energy hub. Absolutely right. Turkey has a capitalist economy. It is a trading country. It's not like it doesn't have one of these bizarre, dysfunctional command economies like Iran. It is part of the global system, and its leaders are susceptible to pressures, incentives, and disincentives of the international system. It wants to rebuild Syria. It wants stability in Syria so that Syria can't be used as a launching pad for attacks against Turkey. That's the number one interest of the Turks, is to prevent terrorist attacks from Syria into Turkey, and to prevent these autonomous PKK zones from building up, from developing. It's going to need investment to achieve all of these goals in Syria, international investment. That's why we can create a Syria. We should all be trying to create Syria as a relatively stable buffer between Turkey and Israel, and we shouldn't do anything that is going to prevent that. And we should be trying to sell this idea in Washington, D.C. One of the problems with the Israeli efforts to counter the Turks is that they are arguments against Turkey in Washington, D.C., and so they increase, a statement by the Israelis in favor of the PKK in northeast Syria activates all of the pro-Israel elements in Washington, D.C. to agitate in favor of the PKK in northeast Syria, and which inclines the Turks to see Israel as a much bigger threat because it is having this influence on Washington, D.C. When Ben Gurion came to Palestine, Ben Gurion went before World War I. Ben Gurion went to Istanbul and learned law, and there's a famous picture of him wearing a fez, because his argument was that the Turks were going to remain the dominant power. Their position in the Middle East was going to become more and more embattled, and the Zionists should present themselves to Istanbul as the most loyal element of the empire. I am with Ben Gurion here. I don't think that they
belatedly
should. I'm with him 100%. I don't think that they should present themselves to Ankara as the most as simply loyal appendages of Ankara, but they should make it very clear to the Turks that they are not signing on to all of the various other agendas that everyone else in the region has against them. Israel has its own interests and its own conflicts with Turkey, and it wants to contain them wherever possible, and it wants to create Syria as a buffer.
So that takes me naturally to my last question. I'm going to ask you both to be a little more succinct, so we can.
I don't do succinct. I don't think Don is a master of the succinct either. So
I can always cut you in the editing if
okay.
Mike. And the question is this. Maybe first to Don, because you seem to agree on the question of Turkey's international role. Dan, are there elements in the larger geopolitical picture that are useful in restraining the Turkish tendency, which you describe, to undermine Israel? One of them is its friction with Iran. It's not a partnership with Israel in the war on Iran, but it's not siding with Iran either. And the second is the larger Western context. So rather, if Turkey is not expelled from NATO, but rather is integrated into the Western system, would that not be a useful leverage to contain its anti-Israel impulses?
Were it not for Erdogan, I could tell the Turks something very simple that would persuade them. there are actually only three countries that really present hope in the Middle East, and this is Turkey, Iran, and Israel. Unfortunately, the Arab world is hopeless. There are exceptions, and I think the UAE is a fascinating exception. But if you look at everything using the Nasserite term from the ocean to the Gulf, the only thing that really is sustainable, that has chances of success in the long run, has societies that are impressive, are the Turks, the Iranians, and the Israelis. At the moment, the Iranians have the problem of the mullahs, and therefore they're on the wrong side of practically everything. Turkey could be on the right side were it not for the preferences of Iran. And in the final analysis, when the Americans must pivot to Asia, to the China Sea, by the way, not just the South China Sea, but the China Sea in general, they must leave the Middle East with somebody. And the only thing they can leave it with at the moment is Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. It would have been a major positive change if they could leave it to Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. In any case, Israel is already an indispensable ally of the United States, and Turkey could be an indispensable ally of the United States if Erdogan can go beyond his obsessions against Israel and the Muslim Brotherhood elements there. So when we come back to Turkey, when we go beyond Erdogan and we come back to Turkey, Turkey can be a stabilizing element. It can be a link between Europe and the Middle East. It can be great in different ways than Erdogan. Erdogan wants to make Turkey great again. Okay, this is his project. Only he's doing it in the wrong way. When Germany wanted to be great, they went to Barbarossa. But now they have a much better way of doing it. The Japanese have a much better way of doing it. The Iranians can have a much better way of doing it. And Turkey doesn't have to change very much except to go back on practically everything that Erdogan did.
Mike?
So Don's discussion of the United States pivoting from the Middle East is really something that I should have put more emphasis on, because I think ultimately this is the question, is that what order do we want to see realistically? What are the realistic possibilities? If you're the United States and you want to pull back from the Middle East, then you have two choices, because there is an anti-American coalition in the Middle East, in the world. The coalition, it's a loose coalition, but it is a coalition: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. They want to supplant the Americans as the number one power and the system that they represent. Obama and Biden, there's a consensus in American society. We don't want large-scale American troop commitments to the Middle East. More military adventures in the Middle East. There's only two possible ways for the United States to come to a new order. One is cut a deal with Iran, which is leading the anti-American coalition in the region. And that's what Obama and Biden tried to do, and they failed. The other one is to work with America's allies to try to create a more stable order. There are only two American allies that have militaries that can project power beyond their borders. That's Turkey and Israel. This is why this question of Syria between Turkey and Israel is such a crucial issue. It is a strategic issue of the first order. Can we get a buffer between Turkey and Israel in Syria, or will Syria's territory continue to be used for attacks against against Israel. I believe, for all the reasons I've said, that there's a very, very good chance of turning Syria into a buffer, but not if the Israelis and their friends in Washington insist on supporting the PKK against Turkey. That will bring the worst elements, the worst elements in Turkish society behind the best elements in opposition to Israel, and will just create a new phase in the Syrian civil war rather than bring it into the civil war. That's what I think we should be looking at. Israelis need to recognize that with the fall of Assad, they just achieved one of the greatest strategic successes they have had in the entire history of the state. The number one threat, if we were talking just a couple of weeks ago, before Assad fell, if we were here talking about the threats arrayed against Israel, we would be talking about Iran's resistance axis, Hezbollah, the Iranian nuclear program. Hamas as well, but Hamas is almost an afterthought now. With the fall of Assad, Hezbollah has been weakened enormously. It will probably never come back to what it was before. During that fight, here's another issue on where Don's depiction of Turkish policy is a gross exaggeration. While Israel was eviscerating Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Turks were silent. They never said a word. They never opposed Israel because it was in their interest that this happened. So Assad fell between the hammer of the IDF and the anvil of the Turkish military. Erdogan's Turkey was a partner with Israel in delivering to a silent partner in delivering to Israel one of the greatest strategic benefits it has ever had in its history. If the United States would look at this and see that Turkish interests and Israeli interests objectively in Iraqi Kurdistan, both Barzani looks to Ankara and to Israel as friends. In Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis look to Ankara and Israel as friends. In many other areas, Israeli interests and Turkish interests are fully compatible. What the Israelis should be calling on America to do is not to go be an opponent of Erdogan. They should be saying, the United States, you should be assigning roles and missions in the region that allow us to maximize the overlapping interests between Israel and Turkey and minimize the friction. That is the message that all Israelis should be sending. And I'll end with this sentence. When Don says Israelis should be calling, or that Turkey should not be in NATO, that is the worst possible advice that anyone could give. NATO accentuates, strengthens the elements in Turkey that see Turkey as a European power, as a friend of the West, as a partner of the West. If you push Turkey out, Turkey will become a very different entity, one that is hostile to the West, and hostility to the West will not be good for Israel.
Dan, final word from you.
No, I think we've exhausted both the fields where we both agree concerning the potential of Turkish-Israeli relations, and our differences concerning whether this potential can be realized unless Erdogan changes something very, very fundamental. And again, I don't insist that he be genuine. As long as he does the right thing, he can be as disingenuous as he wants.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It was a very enlightening and a pleasure to moderate this conversation. In Hebrew, we say, Dan, machloket l'shem shamayim. Nachon? How would you translate that?
Nachon. I don't know. I'm not very good in translations.
Mike, you speak both languages?
I leave it to you. You are the poet among us.
So I'm left with poetry after all this realpolitik. And machloket l'shem shamayim is disagreement for God's sake. basically in Hebrew, which means
on the subject matter without involving personalities.
Dan, I was going to be poetic, and now you're going to be precise. We've been precise enough for today. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm sure people would be very. Mike, you're doing it again. Yalla.
Sam, because I want you. I always like these discussions of Hebrew because does this mean a disagreement? A disagreement that brought us. That brought advantages to us from which we benefited greatly, or a disagreement that doesn't lead us anywhere. This is what
it means. Are you talking about this conversation or about the Hebrew expression? The Hebrew expression is very clear. It's a disinterest. It's a disagreement without any personal interest, or without letting any personal interest interfere. So it's only on the merits of the case. Which is very different from our ego-laden shows usually, Mike, aren't they?
This is the antithesis of academia.
Yes, exactly.
Let's end in agreement, in consensus, that academia is a pile of shit. Can we agree about that?
That is very difficult to get rid of, as Gadi can testify.
Yes, and as Gadi is unfortunately unable to comment as long as he keeps growing his salary. But theoretically speaking, this was definitely an interesting remark. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for listening for this long and fruitful conversation. This is a subject not well treated in the media in general, and an opportunity to remind you that some things you can only hear in the show that is as sane as possible under the circumstances. Huh, Mike? Israel Update will be here on our next regular episode. Thank you very much, Professor Dan Shiftan, for being a guest on this show.